Thank you guys for being here, for hanging around for the last presentation. My name is Aislinn O'Brien. I am a senior here at BU, and the name of my project is How Who is in What Housing Dictates Who is in the House, Understanding Class and Housing in Relation to Campaigns and Political Access. So just to start off, I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with political canvassing in some capacity. Maybe you've been an overly eager campaign member knocking on a stranger's door before. Maybe you've heard your family, your friends complain about these overly enthusiastic and uninvited people who just like show up at your house and call you endlessly. Or maybe you have also been this person like me. But a lot of these experiences that we typically associate with campaign canvassing also heavily rely on the people being canvassed living in single family homes that are easy to canvass. What I'm going to talk about today is that this is like a little bit different if you live in a building like I've shown here on the right that is very dense, is very large, often in an urban location that is incredibly difficult to canvass. And we would find that broadly people living in this type of environment don't really have the same experiences with canvassers coming door to door. So my project is personally based on my own experiences as a person who has gone canvassing in Boston. I've actually been turned away from large housing, like in the photos that I was just showing you. And this really becomes an issue specifically when we're looking at things like public housing. So my project just seeks to better understand this issue and to delve deeper into the issue of barriers to campaign interaction and thus political access, but particularly those that are tied to what exactly your housing looks like. And in particular, I'm really concerned about lower income people who live in larger scale apartment complexes and particularly public housing. For the purposes of my project, the thesis essentially is that lower income populations who live in large scale housing, whether that be in apartments or in public housing itself, face layered barriers to interactions with campaigns and broadly different barriers when it comes to engaging in political processes. Kind of second under this, ultimately, I also find that just letting people into public housing or letting people into large-scale apartment buildings to go door knock is unfortunately not a satisfactory solution. So what was my methodology for this project? It was made up of a few different things. First, we conducted a broad literature review, including academic and non-academic and non-traditional literature. An example of this is I actually reference a Facebook event that I found a few years ago, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later on. But the reason we wanted to do this is to capture a more comprehensive understanding of what exactly it means to be a person like living in this type of environment, what type of on-the-ground organizing is actually happening, and what are any internet records of this, in addition to just like traditional academic perspectives. We also wanted to conduct informational interviews with people who are stakeholders in these processes. And to do this, I actually ended up speaking with 2 Cambridge City councilors that provided really great insight for the project. Lastly, and this was most of the project, was a case study of the New York public housing system, which is run by the New York City Housing Authority, also known as Nycha. So the findings of the literature reviews. The literature reviews actually reaffirmed a lot of the barriers that we suspected existed based on housing, as well as those that we would also intuitively expect to exist because of class. So regarding housing, I pulled a quote here that I thought was particularly insightful. It's for canvassers, locked entrances and hostile apartment management often present insurmountable challenges to reaching tenants within the building. This is from one academic whose research I was reading during the course of my process. And we also just find broadly that there is a lack of any like documentation of campaigns being able to actually get into public housing or get into large scale apartment buildings and successfully door knock. However, we did find a lot of documentation of like this actually not being the case for a lot of campaigns. For example, we found one that was blatantly unconstitutional, which was the refusal of a campaign to enter a public housing building in Virginia. The ACLU actually wrote a letter to the local government complaining about this. So it's been like documented experientially, as well as in things like this letter that we found online in multiple states at multiple different times. So we suspect that this is a larger issue that's happening with public housing, likely across the country. In general, related to like socioeconomic status, we also found a really good quote, just kind of summing up the different barriers that result from this. The quote being, "In democratic elections, any social group that has less money, less flexible schedules, fewer well-resourced friends and less of an appetite for risky endeavors should naturally be disadvantaged in the candidate entry process. And while this does just mention candidate entry specifically, we also think these extend to a lot of negative barriers to people with lower income in general, just being able to participate in political processes. We also interestingly found that perceived social status plays a really important role on whether or not you're actually going to engage in political processes. For example, if you perceive yourself to have less social status, if you think that you're more disadvantaged, that's probably going to deter you to some degree from participating in political processes because you don't feel that they actually have efficacy for you, for example. Regarding our informational interviews, we learned a few interesting things here as well. Some commonalities that we found in our two accounts that we heard from two different Cambridge City councilors were that issue-specific organizing groups are really, really important and really good at mobilizing lower-income voters, particularly if they're around issues related to like tenants groups. We find that they're very able to mobilize people for that reason in particular because it is so foundational. And we also found that, again, people with greater wealth are more vocal in local politics and more able to participate because of the foundational privileges that they do have. Other findings, we also heard about the harms that happen when lower income people are not able to vouch for themselves in terms of politics. We see things like lower income issues being co-opted by wealthier groups who tend to have different perspectives on these. We also heard that there was a ton of value in in-person event outreach, which obviously has been very difficult in the current situation, if not utterly impossible, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit as well. So our findings regarding the Nycha case study, which was the most substantive part of the project, were just a quantification of what exactly these gaps look like in political activity. So one thing that we looked at in particular was voter registration, and how we did this was we compared the list of Nycha addresses of all of their properties in New York that is publicly available. And we also compared that with the New York City voter roll, which links essentially like how many people are registered at a particular address to that address. And we kind of cross-reference them to see exactly how many people were registered at addresses that specifically belong to Nycha, excluding garages, because we assumed that those were probably mistakes. And when we did this, we ultimately found that there was about a 4% gap in the voter registration of the population of people who lived in Nycha versus just like the amount of people that are registered to vote in New York City at large. We also did factor in a like hard maximum to this number. If you essentially take all of the people who live in Nycha whose immigration status is a little bit ambiguous, that can give you a hard cap of the number of people that are able to be registered in the first place. So you would expect that to be a hard maximum that you might get of voter registration. We still find that even if you are in the best case scenario where hypothetically you have that many less people, you still have a gap of about 3% at least, which in the grand scheme of things adds up to a lot of people because, as evidenced by the second graphic we have on screen, Nycha serves 1 in every 15 New Yorkers. So we are talking about basically thousands of people. In terms of campaign documentation, specifically within Nycha housing, there are no records of any candidate-based campaigns being able to do this. Like there are no news articles about it. There are no events that we're able to locate. We did find a few issue-specific groups that exist, but there was this issue of inactivity, especially during the pandemic. I actually reached out to several that I was able to find, and we really struggled to get a response from any. One of the campaigns that we did locate, though, was called Fight for Nycha, which essentially is dedicated to keeping Nycha public instead of privatized, which is this ongoing issue within New York City politics. And we found one Facebook event that they had organized in 2019 to go door knock in the largest project in New York, which is called Queensbridge Houses, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. But yeah, that event on Facebook had 2 people that indicated that they were going, and they were both the organizers of the event. So it's unclear if this event even happened or if they tried to hold it, what ended up happening. The only other instance of canvassing in Nycha that you can actually find evidence of is Nycha is currently undergoing a scandal about lead in its apartment. So it has hired like other consulting groups and whatnot to carry out self-canvassing within Nycha to figure out what families fear that they have lead or like what apartments actually have lead themselves. And again, this has taken them like a very long time. They have still not finished doing this. I think they've been at it for over a a year now. So this is a very daunting thing to do, and also there are no records of campaigns doing this. So in conclusion, based on some of these findings, what we ultimately learned is that door-to-door canvassing is a really problematic solution when it comes to public housing, because the scope of the things that we're talking about are just so insurmountably large. We also found that the importance of like political organizations establishing strong community networks with populations that are like isolated or blocked from political processes is one of the best ways to get these populations engaged. Things like in-person event outreach, working with issue-specific organizations, that these are probably the best way to actually tap into these isolated communities. And also, we learned about the potential for snowball recruitment. For example, if you're able to link into like an activist circle, you're able to build off of that in that way as soon as you find a like link of people who are very into politics. And also just the importance of this network building as a preemptive crisis measure, especially in the current context. Obviously, it's very hard to transition online if you don't have a lot to build off of in person anyway. So hopefully with more emphasis on these strategies, we can see less determination based on housing alone of how exactly people are able to like engage with and be part of political processes in the future. Thank you guys so much for listening.